Hey everybody, welcome to my webinar on the big fat lie. Hello, my name is Miranda. I am a licensed nutritionist and I also practice functional medicine as a nutritionist. You can find me on my website at www.thrivenutritionmn.com. There will be a replay of this webinar, and if you need to get in contact with me, you can certainly do so through my website. And happy Super Bowl Sunday. It should be a good game today. Before I get started on talking about why everything we were told about fat was wrong, I do need to tell you that I am not a doctor and I'm not here to provide you with medical advice or to diagnose or treat you. And that all of the content here is to give you general information. Now, within the last, I would say, 20 years, we've had a huge fear of fat, especially in the 90s. However, that fear was generated more from the 1910s. And in order to understand how everything came to a head in the 1990s and then now today, how we're reversing some of those thoughts, we need to go back to 1910. So a quick history lesson here. Back in 1910, in Russia, scientists were interested in studying the effects of serum cholesterol on the formation of atherosclerosis, which is a type of plaque that forms on the inside of your arterial walls that can block blood flow, leading to heart attacks or stroke. And it was thought that atherosclerosis was a normal part of aging, and the scientists were trying to find ways to slow atherosclerosis formation. And the thought was that if you did that, then it would also slow aging. And what they did in Russia was that they fed cholesterol to rabbits, and they saw a remarkable increase in atherosclerosis and heart attacks in those rabbits. And they also noticed that feeding rabbits with cholesterol-free fat like sunflower oil didn't cause atherosclerosis in rabbits. Now, this study was flawed because rabbits are a very bad model to use, especially for this particular study. And you can't relate rabbits to humans because rabbits are only herbivores, and they usually get no cholesterol whatsoever in their diet versus humans, which we tend to get cholesterol in our diet. And because these rabbits were fed cholesterol, a diet that they typically were not adapted to, is a cause for trouble. Then, if we fast forward to the 1950s, in the year 1958, an American scientist named Ancel Keys started a study called the 7-Country Study. For those of you in Minnesota listening, that guy is from the U of M. He actually was a research scientist at the U of M. And during his 7-country study, he examined the association between diet and cardiovascular disease in different countries. And basically, he skewed the data, which is known as cherry picking. He only used data from countries that supported his theory. And because he cherry picked the data, it's very highly flawed. And even though it was flawed and he had a lot of critique on this, it did actually influence the dietary guidelines over the next few decades. Then, when he presented this information back in 1955 at the World Health Organization in Geneva, Ancel Keys offered what became known as his lipid hypothesis, which claimed dietary fat raised cholesterol, subsequently increasing heart disease. And over time, he modified his argument to point the finger solely at saturated fat, whereas unsaturated fat and vegetable oils could benefit health. He claimed saturated fats created adverse effects. And over time, the American Heart Association embraced Keyes' hypothesis, warning that butter, eggs, meat, and other saturated fat-rich foods contributed to heart disease, and they began emphasizing a low-fat diet to prevent heart disease. Then in 1977, the first dietary goals for the United States was released to reverse the epidemic of heart disease that was happening here in America. And that also received massive criticism at the time from many respected scientists who insisted that sugar was to blame. And the American Medical Association also was very skeptical of these guidelines. However, these guidelines were picked up by the USDA, and very conveniently, it was their job to also sell grains. And basically, these guidelines promoted a low-fat, high-carb diet for everyone. And in 1992, we can look at the USDA guidelines that were released. And I'm sure most of you are familiar with the food pyramid. And this food pyramid is based off of observational studies made by biased scientists and had nothing even closely resembling scientific proof to back up this guideline. And since then, many randomized controlled trials have shown that this dietary approach doesn't really work for people it was meant to help. And an interesting fact is that the obesity epidemic started around the time these guidelines were published, and the diabetes epidemic soon followed after. And as we can see, the base of this pyramid is bread, cereal, rice, and pasta. 6 to 11 servings per day, which is extraordinarily high. And it had a lot of critique too, where fats was up at the top with oils and sweets, and it didn't differentiate between artificial sugar and different types of fat, and not very many vegetables. So we'll see how this pyramid evolves over time. All right, so this was from 1992. Then we can look at 2005. The pyramid is still being used. However, now instead of having everything kind of layered, it's now has different sections of the food pyramid. And it says that, or it appears as though you'd still be having a lot of grains, but maybe the same amount. I mean, it's not quite the same, I guess, but it's kind of confusing how it looks. But you can see that overall, oils is limited and milk is strongly encouraged. And now they state that low-fat milk or dairy products is ideal versus the other one. It didn't mention that. I just wanted to point out too that 3 cups per day of low-fat milk is 33 grams of sugar. And adult women, their maximum of sugar per day should be about 24 grams. And that's, I mean, just having your milk that the government wants you to drink, you're already having way too much sugar. And then again, strongly promotes vegetable oils as being part of your fat intake. But overall, they only mention oils, not really healthy fats like avocados. They do mention nuts, but not really seeds. So we're kind of limited on the data here on what they want us to eat. And then again in 2010, the USDA released new guidelines. The food pyramid was no longer, and it became My Plate. And they, Harvard has criticized this plate because they have no water, instead they have dairy. And this may have to do with how the dairy industry influences the government and the USDA guidelines. All right, so now we are to current day 2015, well, it's actually 2016, but 2015, we were due for new guidelines, and they released not really a pyramid or a plate from what I can tell, but they did discuss in an article about some of the changes that were being made for this current guideline, which will be from 2015 to 2020. And the government actually did make some positive changes. They really discussed how cholesterol is no longer a villain. Prior to then, cholesterol was approached as something that should be limited, and which was at 300 milligrams daily was the limit, and that's actually no longer. And then if you compare cholesterol, a large egg has about 186 milligrams of cholesterol. So you couldn't really even have 2 eggs per day, because then you'd be having, quote unquote, too much cholesterol. However, there's been so many studies showing that cholesterol does not raise your blood cholesterol levels. And finally, the government is starting to come around where they say that cholesterol is not a nutrient of concern because cholesterol from foods doesn't cause higher blood cholesterol levels, except in a very, very small population. But overall, our bodies actually make most cholesterol. And the 2015 guidelines have a stronger focus on sugar, which is great. They are acknowledging the link between excess sugar and weight gain. They recommend keeping added sugars to less than 10% of total calories, or 200 calories from sugar on a 2,000 calorie a day diet. And 1 teaspoon of sugar has 16 calories, and 13 teaspoons has 208. So you could potentially have about 13 teaspoons of sugar on a 2,000 calorie diet. However, the American Heart Association, which is an association that I really applaud for being wary of sugar, they recommend for women no more than 100 calories per day, which equals 6 teaspoons or 24 grams. And men, no more than 150 calories per day, which is 9 teaspoons or 36 grams. Now you can see, especially for men, they may have 2,000 calories per day, and yet these guidelines are still really high in sugar when you compare USDA to the American Heart Association. This is the first time that I've noticed that the USDA has an opinion on artificial sweeteners. In the report they released, they've stated that while these sweeteners may help people lose weight in the short term, there's actually little evidence on the long-term effects on weight loss and weight maintenance. And they recommend to not rely on artificial sweeteners solely to replace added sugars in food and beverages. And they've finally stated to drink more water instead, which is a great thing, great progress for them. And then they've talked about trans fats in the past, but again, they're talking about it still, which is important. They recommend that people should limit their intake of trans fats to as low as possible by limiting foods that contain synthetic sources of trans fats, like partially hydrogenated oils and margarines, and by limiting other solid fats. But the 2015 guidelines still have some limitations. There is still a focus on eating less saturated fat. They state that ideally we should eat less than 10% of calories from saturated fat. That's about 20 grams of saturated fat on a 2,000 calorie a day diet. And 1 ounce slice of provolone cheese has nearly 5 grams of saturated fat. There is still an emphasis on grain intake. They say that the recommended amount of grains on the 2,000 calorie level is 6 ounce equivalents per day, which is kind of like, what is 6 ounce equivalents per day? What does that mean? It's not 6 ounces. It's actually roughly 6 servings of grains. So in general, 1 slice of bread, 1 cup of ready-to-eat cereal, or half a cup of cooked rice, cooked pasta, or cooked cereal can be considered as 1 ounce equivalent from the grains group. There's also still a strong focus on dairy intake, especially fat-free and low-fat dairy. Fat-free and low-fat dairy, 1% dairy products provide, this is what they say, provides the same nutrients but less fat and fewer calories than higher fat options, such as 2% in whole milk and regular cheese. And this is also another critique that I have of this guideline, is that they're so focused on calories, and really it's not about calories in and calories out. That's an outdated approach. And fat is really important. We'll talk about why fat's important for us, but again, they're still focusing on calories and limiting high-fat foods because they have higher calories. So it's another thing that I am not excited about from the new guidelines. They also mention oil intake. And they say commonly consumed oils extracted from plants include canola, corn, olive, peanut, safflower, soybean, and sunflower oils. Oils are naturally present in nuts, seeds, seafood, olives, and avocados. The fat in some tropical plants, such as coconut oil, palm kernel oil, and palm oil, are not included in the oils category because they do not resemble other oils in their composition. Specifically, they contain a higher percentage of saturated fats than other oils. And as we'll see, saturated fats are not an issue, but the government is really promoting these plant oils, which really, they give a variety, but most of the processed foods have corn, soy, and canola, and these are all GMO foods too. All right, talked a little bit about the history, talked about our current guidelines. Now, why does our body need fat and cholesterol? The body uses fat as one of its most basic building blocks. The body uses fat to make cellular membranes. It helps with hormone creation. It absorbs, fat helps absorb fat-soluble vitamins like A, D, E, and K. So for example, a lot of skim milks are fortified with these vitamins, but your body, if you're just drinking that milk and there's no fat in it, your body can't actually absorb these vitamins because it needs fat to absorb those vitamins. So you can actually be deficient in these fat-soluble vitamins if you eat a low-fat diet. It's also of important note to mention that the brain is the fattest organ in your body. It is 60% fat. And 25% of the cholesterol in your body is found in your brain. And then cholesterol plays important roles in such things as membrane function. It acts as an antioxidant and serves as the raw material for which we are able to make things like sex hormones, progesterone, estrogen, cortisol, testosterone, and even vitamin D. And when you eat good fats, it feeds your brain, especially omega-3 fatty acids, which are highly concentrated in the brain and appear to be important for cognitive, which means brain memory and performance, and behavioral functions. And saturated fats, as we have seen, have been demonized ever since Ansel Keys' landmark 7-country study in the 1970s. Keys, again, cherry-picked his data, conveniently excluding whatever didn't fit his hypothesis. And in fact, the countries he studied that had the highest rates of heart disease also were the countries with the highest intakes of sugar and refined carbohydrates. Was it the fat or was it the sugar? It turns out it's the sugar. And even though critics pointed out these and other fallacies in Keys's work, the government bought into the saturated fat is harmful myth, ushering the public to avoid it like the plague for decades and to choose instead inflammatory vegetable oils and trans fats and fake foods like margarine. And the truth is, fats can be complicated. Some fats do raise cholesterol while others lower cholesterol. And really it's the ratio of total to LDL cholesterol that is a far more important predictor of heart attacks than just LDL itself. And we can use the example of grass-fed beef. It's lower in saturated fat than grain-fed beef, roughly 40 to 50% of the fat in grass-fed beef is saturated. And when you compare grain-fed beef to grass-fed beef contains more stearic acid, which is a saturated fat that doesn't increase cholesterol. In fact, one study in the journal Lipid found stearic acid lowering LDL cholesterol. And grass-fed beef contains lower amounts of palmitic acid and myristic acid, which are two saturated fats that can potentially raise cholesterol. Also, cholesterol has been demonized for a long time, but if you work with a functional medicine doctor or a nutritionist, it's actually the type of cholesterol that becomes more relevant than raising cholesterol itself. And if you can look at this picture that I added, you can see that cholesterol on both ends are the same weight, which could be a value found in a blood draw. But as you can see, there are different sizes. And you can have large LDL particles and you can have small LDL particles. And researchers now understand that high-density lipoprotein, HDL, and low-density lipoprotein, LDL, the molecules that carry cholesterol, come in several types. Larger, fluffy, good molecules are harmless because they bounce around, whereas small pellet-like bad molecules can actually create and exacerbate problems. They can lodge themselves into your cell or your artery walls. They are also, the smaller ones are more likely to oxidize and stick. And an interesting thing was discovered. Researchers found when folks consumed more saturated fat, especially from healthy sources like coconut oil, their good LDL cholesterol increases and their bad LDL decreases. So they got more light and fluffy LDL and they got less small LDL. Saturated fats in foods like extra virgin coconut butter fuels your mitochondria too, and it provides anti-inflammatory benefits and can even improve your cholesterol numbers. Also, we need to talk about omega-3s and omega-6s. We've talked about saturated fat, cholesterol, and now omega-3s and 6s. And I think a lot of people have heard about omega-3s and how they're good for you. We'll talk a little bit about why. But then there are also omega-6s. And these two different types of fats are essential, and your body needs a balance of these two types of fats. Omega-3s are anti-inflammatory, and omega-6s are good for us in moderation. When we have a lot, then it actually causes inflammation in the body. And so if you're thinking about heart health, a good ratio of omega-3s to 6s is 1:2, or even better, 1:1. So if for every one omega-3 you eat, you should have one omega-6. Or every one omega-3, you should have up to 2 6s. Now, that's in an ideal situation. However, when we look at modern diets, 6s to 3s, the ratio is actually 20 omega-6s to 1 omega-3, and that upregulates inflammation, which leads to diabetes, arthritis, heart disease, cancer, dementia, and weight gain. And these omega-6s are really high in oils, in vegetable oils. So our government is telling us, eat all of these oils, they're so healthy for you. And yet here we go, we're getting way too many omega-6s. And we're getting them, or let me just tell you a little bit about what they do too, and why we're getting them in our diet. So we get the omega-6s from processed foods, Processed foods are cheap, and they are made with poor quality refined omega-6 fats, which again are corn, soy, safflower, canola. And then why are these put into our foods? Well, these are abundant and they're cheap because they're subsidized by the government. And they're also put into foods, processed foods, to make them taste better, and it helps improve texture. And then these fats make cell membranes subpar. These membranes become rigid and stiff. Our cells become slower in their functions, and it promotes inflammation. And you can get these pro-inflammatory foods from vegetable oils. You can get these from conventionally raised animals because they're fed grains. Also, farmed fish are also fed grains, and we become what we eat. That's the same as the animals that we eat. They become what they eat. And I would caution you, like for instance, salmon, a lot of people eat salmon because it's high in healthy fats, omega-3s. However, if you're eating farm-raised salmon, they're being fed grains, so they won't be high in omega-3s, and you won't be getting the benefits that you're seeking by eating that salmon. And then ourselves, we can get inflammation from the omega-6s from having carbohydrates. Just like how conventionally raised fish and animals are fed grains are high in omega-6s, we too, when we have too many grains and too much sugar, that really raises our levels of chronic inflammation. And when we have a diet high in omega-6s, it further increases our need for the anti-inflammatory omega-3 fats. And it's really important to note that sugar is another enemy. Along with those omega-6s, sugar is another culprit. And also the trans fats is another culprit. But it's unfortunate with sugar that it hasn't really been acknowledged until this year, really, with the government, with their guidelines, the USDA guidelines. They've really neglected to focus on sugar for decades, and we now have sugar from GMO sugar beets. If the package doesn't say cane sugar, it's typically from GMO sugar beets. And another popular form of sugar is high fructose corn syrup. So we're getting the omega-3s or the 6s from the corn oil, and then we're getting the sugar from the high fructose corn syrup. Corn is everywhere, and it's being fed to our animals. And to go back in history a little bit, a century ago, we ate far more saturated fat but had less heart disease and heart attacks. Butter and lard were staples, and heart attacks were rare and almost unknown. We also ate a lot less sugar, and zero of our sugar came from high fructose corn syrup. And if you did have sugar, really it was in the form of like baked goods, which had to be, I mean, think about making a pie by hand. It's really labor intensive. We can go to the bakery and pick up a pie, but if you were to really make it by scratch, it takes a lot of time. And they didn't always add as much sugar as we add to our current treats. So we tend to have a lot more of the sugar in baked goods and in sodas, and it's really accessible, and we typically add a lot more than we would in the past, and this is all compounding. And so today, the average kid consumes about 34 teaspoons of sugar every single day, largely as high fructose corn syrup, which are found in sodas and processed foods. We went from eating about 10 pounds of sugar a year in the 1800s to 150 pounds today. And that's average. Some people eat much more than that. High fructose corn syrup was introduced about 30 years ago, and we've gone from 0 to 66 pounds of this frankenfood annually. It's no coincidence that within that time period, we've seen obesity and chronic illness rates skyrocket, which is including heart disease. One recent study published in JAMA Internal medicine found, even accounting for other risk factors, that those with the highest sugar intake had a 4-fold increase in their risk of heart attacks compared to those with the lowest intakes. And I wanted to make a special mention on high fructose corn syrup. It is metabolized much differently than glucose. Fructose is a sugar found in everything from high fructose corn syrup to fruit juice to agave syrup, and it's actually extremely harmful to us when consumed in excess. And I'm not talking about having a whole fruit. You don't need to worry about that, okay? That's fine. But when the fructose is extracted, or if you're doing like juicing, but you're only doing fruits, you're getting a lot of fructose. And unlike glucose, which can be used by virtually every single cell in your body, fructose can only be metabolized by your liver. And that's because your liver is the only organ that has the transporter for it. Excess fructose in many ways is very similar to alcohol and the damage it causes your liver, because the metabolism of fructose and alcohol is very similar. And fructose is metabolized directly into fat, not cellular energy like glucose. So I want to let that sink in a little bit, that fructose actually gets directly converted into fat. Ironically, the USDA guidelines today restrict saturated fat to no more than 10% of a person's caloric intake, yet up until recently, there were no strict guidelines on sugar. Among its many problems, sugar contributes to inflammation, which is the root cause of heart disease, as well as high triglycerides, lower HDL, good cholesterol, and dangerous small LDL, bad cholesterol. Many of the low-fat and fat-free frankenfoods we've consumed over the past few decades have been higher in sugar, especially high fructose corn syrup. And we've all been sold a bill of goods about so-called healthy low-fat foods like cookies and muffins. When you begin to read the labels, you'll quickly see how much sugar is added to just about everything, especially low-fat foods. And that's why it becomes really important to look at food labels, the back, the nutrition labels, and the ingredients. Ignore the front of the box. That's all designed to appear really healthy and good for you. And you can find out quite quickly by looking and reading labels that it's typically, you know, if you're in the middle of the grocery store, it's probably not a good thing to buy. And then also with sugar, transitioning back to saturated fats, it's not a great idea to lump all saturated fats into one category. That oversimplifies things and so this would be like clumping all carbohydrates together and saying that those are all bad. Broccoli and a hot fudge sundae are both carbohydrates, yet you know that one benefits you and then the other one doesn't. All right, so you're probably wondering, okay, Miranda, what do I eat then? I know that saturated fats can be good. I know to avoid trans fats. I know that omega-3s are good, and I know the difference between that and omega-6s. What do I eat? So one step would be to eat more wild or sustainably raised cold water fish. You can aim for 2 servings of low mercury fish per week. That can be wild salmon, sardines, herring, halibut, mackerel, and tuna. And you really want to know where your catch comes from. So you can use www.seafoodwatch.org or use their app to see where your fish is coming from. And it's important to note that omega-3s are very sensitive to light and to heat, and that when you cook foods that are high on omega-3s, you just have to be a little careful with them as to not damage the omega-3s. And if you're having those wild if you're having wild salmon for dinner, you want to have it steamed or lightly grilled to preserve the integrity of the omega-3s. Coastal Seafoods is a great resource. You can get 20% off of certain salmon and other fish on Thursdays. And if you're local here in the Twin Cities, Fresh Thyme is a new grocer, and they think they're in Bloomington. It's kind of like the Aldi of Whole Foods in a way. So it's cheaper food, but they offer really good pricing on meat. The second thing you can do is to buy pasture-raised eggs. Eggs are one of the few animal products low in toxins and high in quality fats that balance blood sugar. Eggs also contain DHA, cholesterol, saturated fat, and choline. And a good way to cook eggs would be over easy on low to medium heat, hard-boiled or poached eggs. And you can see here in the picture, there's a difference between cage-free and pasture-raised. Third thing you can do is incorporate a variety of nuts and seeds. Mix it up, variety matters. Try not to eat them that are roasted in peanut oil or corn oil. Try to eat them raw, sprouted, or as like a raw butter. So almond butter, cashew butter, Brazil nut butter. And then seeds are important too. So try to get in some flax seeds, chia seeds, and hemp seeds. Fourth thing you can do would be to incorporate good oils. Olive oil can be drizzled onto any cooked meal. And I mentioned cooked. Ideally, don't really cook food in olive oil. Rather, use it as more of a finishing oil because it can also be degraded down by heat. You can get quality olive oils by looking for the seal from the International Olive Oil Council. You also want to get fresh oils, so look on the bottles with a best by date, or better yet, a harvest date. And try to buy oils only from this year's harvest. Best by dates are usually 2 years from the time of oil was bottled. And so if you see a date that is 2 years away, then the oil is most likely to be fresh. And like I mentioned, oils can be damaged by heat and they can be damaged by light. So try to shop for oils in dark bottles. And some of these oils may also be in the fridge section in co-ops, which would be flax oils and fish oils. And then extra virgin olive oil does solidify when it's cold, and it should become cloudy and thicken if it's refrigerated. You can also start incorporating quality coconut oil. It contains a lot of medium chain triglycerides, which are metabolized differently and can have therapeutic effects on your brain. 1 tablespoon of coconut oil in the morning in your coffee can boost your metabolism, stabilize insulin levels, and help you burn fat throughout the day. Coconut oil is also best if it's cold pressed and virgin. Avoid refined anything. Really just avoid any refined oil. So avoid refined coconut oil, and it should smell like you're at the beach. It's also an excellent skin moisturizer. It's great for taking off makeup. You can even rinse your mouth out with it, like do oil pulling for oral health. You can also make bulletproof coffee with coconut oil. If you haven't heard of it before, it's 2 tablespoons of grass-fed butter with 1 tablespoon of coconut oil, and then you blend it either in a blender or with an immersion blender. You can add different flavorings like coconut milk, cinnamon, vanilla. You can also do an upgraded bulletproof coffee, so you would add coconut oil, cream, raw cream from grass-fed cows, natural sweeteners, grass-fed gelatin, and sea salt. 6th option or suggestion is eat lots of avocados. They're high in monounsaturated fats, and that helps reverse insulin resistance and regulate blood sugar levels. Avocados and avocado oil are some of the richest sources in the world. Avocados are also high in fat-soluble vitamins A, E, and K. They're high in water-soluble vitamins B and C. They have twice the potassium as bananas. They contain more soluble fiber than most foods, and it helps facilitate bowel regularity and maintain weight control. They also have more protein and less sugar than any other fruit, which helps build muscle and burn fat. And it's also high in phytonutrients, phytochemicals, and folate. Great for any mamas anyone who is wanting to conceive or pregnant. And you can use avocados in a number of ways. It can be used as a fat replacement in baking. And you can always top your soups and salads with it. You can make a variety of things with avocados, like avocado pudding. You can add it to your smoothies to give it a creamy texture. You can mash it, and that can be great for baby food or even guacamole, putting it on top of salad. And one tip that I like to use all the time is keep my avocados in the fridge. It helps slow down their ripening. Or if you have an avocado that is ripe that you're not quite ready to eat, then you can also keep it in the fridge. You can also freeze your avocados too. So you can always peel your avocados and put them in a container, put them in the fridge, and then break off some chunks and put it in your smoothie. The seventh tip would be buying grass-fed meats whenever possible. Cows should be eating their native food grass, not GMO-laden grains. Back to Fresh Thyme, they sell frozen beef at about $3.98 per pound. And grass-fed is defined by the USDA as an animal fed only mother's milk and grass or other greens its entire life. But it doesn't specify fresh or store greens. Animals labeled grass-fed may be confined to pens and fed hay much of their lives, and they can still receive antibiotics and growth hormones. You can always talk to your supplier about where your beef is coming from, what it's fed. A lot of co-ops even have that information right where the beef is. You can work with local farmers to get beef. You can do like larger quantities. So you can get a quarter of a cow or half a cow and share it with your family, and that can be a cheaper way to have grass-fed meat. Same thing with the salmon. With grass-fed meat, you want to cook it slowly because it does cook quickly, and using some lower heat. You can cook your beef low and slow at about 300 degrees for a few hours, and that can help make tougher meat more tender. And then we talked about the best thing to do is purchase that grass-fed beef. It's up to 3 times higher in nutrients, it's full of the good fat. It is lower in toxin content, it's good for the environment, and it's really ethical. Some other options would be beef that's fed some hay and some silage. Another option that's slightly worse than that is grass-fed but grain finished, and a lot of times there are cows that are fed grass, but they're also fed grain, or they're fed grass their whole lives up until they're about to be slaughtered, and then they are fed grain. And then the worst option would be grain-fed beef. And even if it's organic, which is good because it's not having GMOs, as we know, grain-fed beef will have the higher omega-6 content. And also, when they're fed grains, the grains can become rancid and have mycotoxins in the grain, and it's not really great for the environment either. Another option is to have grass-fed butter. Grass-fed butter is higher than grain-fed and even organic butter in omega-3s, CLA, beta-carotene, vitamins A, D, E, and K, as well as antioxidants. And you can actually see the difference between grass-fed butter and organic butter. This beautiful yellow stick is grass-fed butter, and this white stick is organic butter. You can also see the difference in eggs that are pasture-raised versus eggs that are cage-free. Eggs that are pasture-raised are almost orange. They're so dark yellow. And then if you have traditional cage-free eggs, they're more of a muted yellow. And butter is also high in butyrate, which is a short-chain fatty acid that prevents and decreases inflammation in humans. And then CLA is also being studied intensively because it also helps with weight loss. And one last note that I wanted to leave you with today is comparing low-fat, high-carb diets versus high-fat, low-carb diets. This gentleman, Dr. David Ludwig, is a researcher and Harvard professor that recently released a book called Always Hungry. And he found that metabolism on high-carb diets decreases about 300 calories per day, which is similar to what the government has been telling us to eat for many, many years. And anyone who's fat phobic or on a diet, if they try to avoid fat as much as possible because it has a higher calorie content, by having those higher carb diets, you're actually decreasing your metabolism. And the high carb diets will lead to roller coaster blood sugar levels, and that increases insulin. And when insulin is high, it locks the sugar away in storage in the fat cells. And when we think about obesity as a state of excess, it's like that person's carrying so much weight. It's that state of too much. But when you look at the biochemistry of obesity, it's actually closer to starvation because of the high insulin levels. It causes the fat cells to store and lock away that blood sugar as fat. And the fat cells then are hoarding calories, and your body can't tap into that energy. So when they compared the high carb diet with a decrease in metabolism of 300 calories per day, on the flip side, the low carb, high fat diet the metabolism of that didn't drop at all, even though it's known that losing weight by cutting calories slows down the metabolism. When you eat a high fat diet, you don't have a slower metabolism. And that's amazing because when you diet, your metabolism decreases, which then makes it easier to gain weight and harder to maintain that weight lost. So, moral of the story here, I think, is to really focus on having a higher fat, high healthy fat. We've talked about those healthier fats, why it's important, and reducing carbohydrate. And that would look like few grains, going gluten-free, but not eating the gluten-free processed foods, rather having some ancient grains. If you don't have an autoimmune condition, if you have an autoimmune condition, eliminating grains, and then having fruit as your carbohydrate source. So that was the presentation today. Thank you so much for listening in. If you wanted to work with me, I work with clients nationally and locally. I have an office in Minneapolis, uptown area, and I also work with clients over the phone and through Skype. And if you wanted to do that, you can certainly visit my website at www.thrivenutritionmn.com. Thank you.